Madam President.
The senator from South Dakota.
Madam President, I wanted to speak to an amendment that I had introduced and filed, and it was made pending at the desk earlier today. And what that amendment would do is eliminate new government programs that are created by the proposed trillion-dollar stimulus legislation that is before the United States Senate today. Now, earlier, yesterday, I presented some information about the size and scope of this legislation and tried to put in very visual terms the immense amount of money that we're talking about when you start looking at $1 trillion, $900 billion, and when you add interest on top of that, $340, $350 billion in interest, you've got $1.2 trillion in new spending included in the stimulus bill. And I say that because I think it's important to point out that that's not the end. It's frankly the beginning. We know for a fact that the omnibus appropriation bill, the sort of catch-all appropriation bill that we didn't complete last year, is going to be coming before the Congress, before the House probably first, but then before the Senate. And that, for the first time ever, is going to exceed $1 trillion. So we've got $1 trillion in the catch-all appropriation bill. We've got, we expect at least, a request from the administration for additional TARP authority, emergency funding to provide stabilization for the financial markets, to the tune of several $100 billion. We don't know exactly what that's going to be, but we know it's going to be in the multiples with respect to hundreds of billions of dollars. And we also have a supplemental appropriation bill that will be coming shortly after that to fund the ongoing conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. My point very simply is this. This is trillions of dollars of spending. This is a spending spree that is unprecedented even in this city, which is known for spending lots of money on lots of programs. What this amendment attempts to do is to put a little bit of restraint on some of that spending in the stimulus bill. Now, granted, many of us believe that there's some things that we should be doing, some steps that we should be taking that would help the economy recover, stimulate the economy, and create jobs. Regrettably, the stimulus bill that's in front of us goes way beyond that, because the President's top economic advisor suggested when this whole debate began that whatever we do in terms of stimulus should be temporary, it should be targeted, and it should be timely. And much of what's included in this bill is none of the above. In fact, it's slow, it's unfocused, and unending. And so what I would attempt to do with this amendment is to simply say that new programs that are created in this bill have to have been authorized by February 1st of this year. In other words, earlier this week. So if there's not an authorization for this new program, and we ask OMB to make that determination, that the spending would be knocked out of the bill, essentially. And the whole, I guess, purpose of the amendment is, again, to say that if we're going to do something that is meaningful in terms of stimulating the economy, it should be temporary, and it should be targeted and focused. And much of the spending that's in this bill is anything but that. And history has shown time and again that when you put new programs on the books, you almost always take a long time to get those programs off the ground. And in fact, the Congressional Budget Office has examined this issue, and they offered this insight, which I quote, and it says, brand new programs pose additional challenges. Developing procedures and criteria, issuing the necessary regulations, and reviewing plans and proposals would make distributing money quickly even more difficult, as can be seen, for example, in the lack of any disbursements to date under the loan programs established for automakers last summer to invest in producing energy-efficient vehicles. Throughout the federal government, spending for new programs has frequently been slower than expected and rarely been faster. And I end quote. And again, that's the Congressional Budget Office. Now, given the current state of the economy, Madam President, we simply can't afford to enact costly new programs that have little hope of making any real meaningful impact now when the American people need it the most. Madam President, there may be programs in this proposed legislation that are worthy of support. I'm not arguing that point, but surely not under the guise of economic stimulus. There are new programs that are created that will add to the size of this. And many of us have reacted to the size of it, and as I said already, we know for a fact that there's going to be a lot of additional spending coming down the pike that we're going to be asked to consider. But adding to that $1 trillion for something that arguably does not create economic stimulus, does not create jobs, seems to me to be the wrong direction in which to head. And so the amendment would simply prevent any new funding under the economic stimulus plan from going toward new programs that were not authorized before February 1st of this year, 2009. And as I said before, the amendment calls on the Office of Management and Budget to determine if a program was authorized before February of 2009. If the program fails to meet that standard, the program will not receive funding from the economic stimulus proposal. Now, Madam President, I would argue that this is a very common sense proposal that protects the taxpayer, ensures funds are spent in a timely and effective manner. And that isn't to say, I'll repeat myself, as I said earlier, that many of these programs perhaps are worthwhile. And frankly, we ought to consider them, but we ought to do it under the regular order and procedures that we have here in the United States Senate. We ought to have committee action. We ought to have hearings. We ought to have the necessary oversight. We ought to be able to put these things on the floor where they can be debated, and we have a process for doing that. And there are lots of these programs that are included in the stimulus bill, which I would argue, Madam President, don't meet that criteria. They aren't stimulus because they're not targeted, they are not timely, they are not temporary. They are in fact creating new programs, which, as I said earlier, the Congressional Budget Office has told us sometimes take a very, very long time to roll out. And I think any of us can speak from experience on that point. Whenever we create any sort of a new federal program, you've got agencies that have to interpret it, you've got regulations that have to be promulgated. In many cases, you're setting up new bureaucracies and people have to be hired. It makes no sense to me whatsoever for us to, in the context of an economic stimulus bill, start talking about new programs. And I would also say that the whole purpose of this exercise, in my opinion at least, is job creation. It's to get the economy back on track and recovering and to create jobs. We've been losing jobs. The economy is hemorrhaging. A lot of people are hurting across the country. What they don't need is more spending on government programs here in Washington, D.C. What we ought to be doing, on the other hand, is getting more money into the hands of the American people so that they can spend it, more incentives for small businesses to begin to invest and create jobs, because that's what they do best. And in fact, 2/3 to 3/4 of all the jobs created in our economy are created by small businesses. Now, $900 billion principal amount, and with interest over $1 trillion in new spending as is proposed in this stimulus legislation. If you divide that by the number of jobs that are proposed to be created, somewhere around 3 million, that comes out to $300,000 per job. Now, the average annual wage in my state of South Dakota is under $30,000 a year. It's very difficult to explain to a constituent of mine in South Dakota how the federal government proposes to spend $300,000 per job of their tax dollars to create jobs at a time when we are handing the largest burden of debt to the next generation in American history. And many of these jobs that are proposed are government jobs, and the government can create government jobs, and many of the spending programs in this bill do put money into federal agencies which create government jobs, but at an enormous cost. And I would use the example of the State Department, where it's over $1 million, I think $1.3 million, something to that effect, per job created. That doesn't seem to be a very good use of taxpayer dollars, Madam President, and it does not get us the bang for our buck that everybody has been coming to the floor and talking about. And so, as I said, it's a straightforward amendment. All it simply says is no new government programs created in the stimulus. If that program was not authorized by February 1st of this year, then any funding for it in the economic stimulus proposal would be denied. It's a common sense proposal. It does protect the taxpayers. It ensures that funds are spent in a timely and effective way, and that we keep the focus of this entire exercise about creating jobs out there in the economy, putting people back to work, not spending on new government programs in Washington, D.C., which, however well-intended, need to go through a normal, regular order process where members of the United States Senate have an opportunity to evaluate those at the committee level, and go through all the appropriate oversight that we normally include when it comes to creating new government programs. And frankly, I don't think that the creating new government programs in the first place is the way to do this, but at least this amendment, I think, brings some semblance of sanity to a bill which is, as I said, is sort of a shotgun approach that throws money at all kinds of different programs in hopes that it will do something to stimulate the economy, knowing full well, I believe, that many of these are not going to be stimulative, but on the other hand, are creating new programs that people have wanted to do for a long time but never had the opportunity to. That's not what this is about. This economic stimulus debate ought to be focused on creating jobs and getting the economy on the pathway to recovery. And so that's the amendment, Madam President. I would encourage my colleagues to support it. I think it's very straightforward, very commonsensical, and hopefully it will meet with the approval of a majority of the members of the United States Senate. And Madam President, I yield back the floor and the balance of my time.